The dust bit at her eyes, each grain a tiny shard of the hell she was leaving behind. Her lungs burned, a raw fire stoked by ragged breaths. Thorns tore at the thin fabric of her dress, at skin already flayed by sun and desperation. She did not know how long she had run, only that the running was all that was left. Behind her, the memory of a voice, sharp as broken glass, and the shadow of a hand that knew only how to crush. Before her, nothing but an expanse of baked earth and skeletal trees, the horizon wavering in the merciless heat. She stumbled, a small, choked cry escaping her lips as her ankle turned on a loose stone. The ground rushed up, hard and unyielding. She lay there, a discarded thing, the sun beating down. In her tightly clenched fist, a small, smooth piece of wood, its edges softened by countless turnings in her palm. It was nothing, a splinter from a forgotten life, yet it was all she had carried away. She had no husband, no name she dared speak, no home to return to. Just this aching flight, this dwindling spark of will. The world began to blur, the harsh light softening into a dark velvet. Consciousness frayed. A shadow fell over her. Not the chasing shadow, but something different. Larger. Still. She tried to lift her head, a whimper her only protest. Boots, old and scuffed, entered her fading vision. They stopped a foot from her face. Dust settled around them. Long moments passed, measured only by the thrumming in her ears and the distant caw of a carrion bird. She felt the presence, solid and unwavering, like one of the ancient stones jutting from the parched land. There was no sound from it, no word, no sigh. Just the silent watching. She expected the kick, the rough grasp, the continuation of the nightmare. Instead, the shadow shifted. A canteen, dented and cool, was nudged gently towards her lips. Water. Impossibly. She managed a weak movement, a hand fluttering towards it. Strong, calloused fingers, surprisingly gentle, tipped the canteen. A trickle of water, metallic and life-giving, touched her cracked lips. It was a baptism in a barren church. He watched her, his face unreadable in the harsh glare, shadowed by the brim of a wide, stained hat. His eyes, though, were like chips of winter sky, unexpectedly clear and holding a depth she could not fathom. She drank, a little more this time, the coolness spreading through her parched throat like a prayer answered. Then, with an economy of movement that spoke of long habit, he knelt. He did not touch her beyond the offering of water. He simply looked at her, at the torn dress, the bleeding scrapes, the exhaustion that was a shroud. His gaze was not judgmental, not pitying, merely observant. He was a man made of the same silence as the canyons, weathered and enduring. She closed her eyes, a single tear escaping to trace a clean path through the grime on her cheek. It was too much, this unexpected pause in her torment. The fight was gone. If this was the end, let it be. But then, she felt herself being lifted. Not with brutality, but with a strange, careful strength. His arms were like oak branches, unyielding but not unkind. He smelled of dust, leather, and something faintly of pine smoke, a scent that was alien and yet, inexplicably, felt like the first breath of safety she had taken in an age. She was too weak to resist, too tired to question. As he carried her, her head lolled against his chest. The rhythm of his walk was steady, measured, like the turning of the earth. The small piece of wood was still clutched in her hand. He didn't try to take it. He simply walked, a silent cowboy moving through a landscape that was as much a part of him as the air he breathed, carrying a woman who had nothing left but the memory of fear and a desperate, unspoken hope for an end to it. The sun dipped lower, painting the desolate land in hues of blood orange and bruised purple. His shadow, and hers within it, stretched long before them, two solitary figures against the indifferent immensity of the world. He walked towards a place only he knew, a refuge carved from the wilderness, a place where the wind whispered different secrets than the one she fled. He carried her to a small cabin, nestled so deep within a fold of the hills it seemed to hide from the sky itself. It was built of rough-hewn logs, chinked with mud and time, smoke curling from a stone chimney like a whispered invitation. The air here was cooler, carrying the scent of cedar and damp earth. He laid her gently on a narrow cot, the straw-filled mattress rustling beneath her slight weight. For a moment, she thought he would leave her there, but he moved with quiet purpose, lighting a small lamp that cast a warm, flickering glow across the single room. The light revealed walls adorned with little more than the marks of his own solitary existence, a few well-worn tools, a rifle resting on wooden pegs, a single, faded photograph of a woman with sad eyes tucked into the frame of a small, cracked mirror. He brought a basin of water, still cool from a spring, and a clean, worn cloth. He hesitated, his gaze on her face, then, with the same impersonal care he might show a wounded animal, he began to clean the dirt and dried blood from her cuts. Her skin flinched at the touch, not from pain, but from the unexpectedness of tenderness. His hands were rough, but his movements were surprisingly deft. He said nothing. The silence in the cabin was thick, broken only by the crackle of the small fire he built in the hearth and the sound of her own shallow breathing. She watched him through slitted eyelids, feigning a deeper unconsciousness than she felt. Fear was still a living thing inside her, a coiled serpent ready to strike. But this man, his quiet efficiency, his lack of demand, chipped away at its icy grip. He moved with a grace that belied his size, preparing a simple broth on the fire. The aroma, thin but savory, filled the small space, a scent of sustenance and something akin to domesticity that was so foreign it made her heart ache. He brought a small bowl to her, propping her head slightly. "Eat," he said. His voice was low, like gravel over velvet, unused but not harsh. It was the first word he had spoken. She sipped the broth, the warmth spreading through her chilled body. It was more than food, it was a tether to life. He watched her, not with scrutiny, but with a distant patience. When she had taken what she could, he took the bowl away. He found an old, clean shirt of his, much too large for her, and laid it on a stool near the cot, along with a pair of mended wool socks. He indicated them with a nod, then turned his back, affording her a privacy she hadn't expected. Trembling, she managed to pull off the remnants of her tattered dress and slip on the shirt. It smelled faintly of him, that scent of dust, leather, and pine smoke. It was a shield. He had a bedroll in the corner, and he spread it near the fire, settling down without another word, turning his back to her once more. Sleep was a long time coming. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat, every creak of the cabin a pursuer. But the steady rhythm of his breathing from across the room, the solid presence of him, was a strange comfort. He was a wall between her and the vast, terrifying emptiness outside. She thought of the men she had known, their loud demands, their cruelties, their easy violence. This man was different. He asked for nothing. He offered solace without a name. Who was he, this silent guardian of the hills? And why had he helped her? The question circled in her weary mind, unanswered. She clutched the piece of wood in her hand, its familiar shape a small anchor in the storm of her uncertainty. Outside, the wind whispered through the pines, a mournful song that seemed to echo the desolation in her soul. Yet, within the cabin, a tiny spark of warmth, a fragile sense of sanctuary, began to glow. He had offered her shelter, a moment of peace in a life that had become a relentless flight. For now, it was enough. The fire in the hearth burned low, casting dancing shadows that were more comforting than menacing. The night deepened, and slowly, exhaustion claimed her, pulling her down into a restless sleep, the image of his still, watchful form by the fire her last waking thought. Days bled into one another, marked by the rising and setting of the sun, the rhythm of his quiet chores. He never asked her name, nor offered his. He never questioned her past, though her nightmares sometimes tore through the cabin's silence, raw screams that left her trembling and slick with sweat. On those nights, he would rise, stir the fire, and place a cup of warm, herb-infused water beside her cot before retreating to his own space, his silence a comforting presence rather than an indifferent one. He would mend her tattered dress with surprising neatness, his large hands working the needle and thread with slow precision. He found a pair of his old, worn-out boots, too big for her, but he painstakingly cut them down, restitched the leather, and lined them with soft rabbit fur he'd trapped. When he presented them to her, he simply set them by her cot. No words. But the gesture was a language she was beginning to understand. It spoke of care, of permanence, of a future that might involve walking, not just running. She began to help, small tentative gestures at first. Sweeping the packed earth floor with a broom he'd fashioned from twigs. Fetching water from the spring, its surface reflecting the vast, clear sky. He would watch her sometimes, his expression unreadable, but she no longer felt the prickle of fear under his gaze. It was a look of quiet assessment, perhaps, or a deep, unspoken sorrow she was starting to recognize as a mirror to her own. One afternoon, while he was out checking his trap lines, she found the faded photograph again. The woman with the sad eyes. His wife? A sister? The grief in those eyes was a familiar country. She traced the outline of the woman's face with a hesitant finger. A life lived, a life lost. It explained some of the silence in him, the hollowness that sometimes looked out from those winter sky eyes. He returned with 2 rabbits, and they prepared them together, a silent ballet of shared tasks. He showed her how to skin them efficiently, his hands guiding hers briefly, a touch that was purely instructional, yet it sent a shiver through her that was not entirely unpleasant. It was contact without threat, a forgotten sensation. As they ate the roasted meat, the silence was comfortable, companionable. She found herself noticing the way the firelight caught the silver in his temples, the network of lines around his eyes that spoke of sun and wind and hardship. One evening, a storm broke, wild and furious. Rain lashed the cabin, and the wind howled like a hungry wolf. The thunder was a physical blow, shaking the small structure. She jumped at each crack, her breath catching in her throat, the terror from her past surging. He saw her fear. He didn't speak, but he moved his bedroll closer to the hearth, placing himself between her and the door, a silent sentinel. He began to carve a piece of wood, a small bird taking shape under his patient knife. The rhythmic scrape of the blade was a counterpoint to the storm's fury, a small sound of creation in the face of chaos. She watched his hands, strong and steady, and slowly, her breathing evened. The storm outside raged, but inside the cabin, a fragile peace held. He finished the bird, its wooden wings slightly upturned, and without looking at her, placed it on the small shelf above her cot. A gift. Like the boots. Like the safety he offered. Later, as the storm began to subside, leaving behind the clean scent of rain-washed earth, she spoke, her voice rusty from disuse, barely a whisper. "Thank you." He paused in his whittling, then gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He didn't look at her. But she knew he had heard. It was a beginning. A crack in the wall of her silence. A single word, offered like a tentative hand reaching out in the dark. The night deepened, the embers in the hearth glowed like sleepy eyes. The knowledge that the man who hunted her, the source of her unending nightmare, was still out there, somewhere, was a cold stone in her belly. But for now, the storm had passed, both outside and, in some small measure, within her. The pursuit was a cold shadow that stretched even to this hidden sanctuary. One morning, as the sun climbed, painting the eastern peaks with strokes of rose and gold, he returned from a scouting trip, his face grimmer than usual, his silence heavier. He carried not game, but news. He laid a single, spent rifle cartridge on the rough wooden table between them. It was new, brassy, unlike the older, weathered shells he used. "Riders," he said, his voice flat, devoid of inflection but carrying a weight that settled like frost in the small cabin. "3 of them. Passed by the lower trail yesterday." Asking questions in the settlement, she froze, the cup of weak tea halfway to her lips. The settlement was a day's ride away. Too close. The blood drained from her face, leaving her skin ashen. The old terror, momentarily subdued, clawed its way back, cold and sharp. Her breath hitched. He watched her, his gaze steady. "They showed a likeness," he continued, his eyes not leaving hers. "A poorly drawn one. Of a woman her." The name she had buried, the face she tried to forget, hunted even here. She wanted to run, to bolt like a frightened deer, but her limbs were lead. The repaired boots, symbols of a tentative hope, now felt like anchors. He saw the panic in her eyes. He reached across the table, not to touch her, but to push the spent cartridge further towards his side, as if taking the threat upon himself. "They won't find this place easily," he said. It was not a boast, but a statement of fact. His knowledge of these harsh, unforgiving hills was an armor. "But they are looking," she swallowed, her throat tight. He sent them, it wasn't a question. The man she fled, the one who saw her as property, a possession to be reclaimed, beaten, and broken anew. His cruelty was a relentless force. The silent cowboy nodded slowly. Likely he rose and went to the pegs where his rifle rested. He checked its action, his movements deliberate, economical. There was no fear in him, only a quiet readiness. A dangerous stillness. She watched him, a new emotion stirring amidst the fear, a fierce, protective anger. Not for herself, but for this man, this sanctuary he had offered. They would defile it, destroy him for harboring her. "I should go," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Before they find me here. Before they hurt you." He turned from the rifle, his gaze piercing. For the first time, she saw something flicker deep in those winter sky eyes, a spark of an emotion she couldn't name, but it wasn't dismissal. "Where would you go?" he asked, his voice still low, but with an edge now. "Back to the dust? Back to the running?" His words were not unkind, but they were a stark reminder of the truth. There was nowhere left for her to run where that shadow wouldn't eventually fall. He walked back to the table, picked up the small wooden bird he had carved for her during the storm. He turned it over in his large hands. "This cabin," he said, his voice softer now, almost reflective. "My father built it. My wife, Sarah, she loved the view from that window." He gestured with his chin towards the small, greased paper pane that looked out onto a vista of jagged peaks. It was the most he had ever spoken of his past. Sarah. The woman in the photograph. The name felt like a soft stone in her mouth. He placed the bird back on the shelf. "Some things," he said, looking at her directly, "are worth protecting." The unspoken message hung in the air between them. He would not send her away. He would stand. The decision settled in the quiet cabin, as solid and unmovable as the mountains themselves. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but now it was overlaid with something else, a grim resolve. She would not be the hunted animal anymore. She looked at his strong, weathered hands, at the quiet determination in his face. She thought of the boots he had made her, the food he had shared, the shelter of his presence. He had asked for nothing, and now he was offering everything. She rose, her movements less tentative now. She went to the hearth, picked up the poker. It was a meager weapon, but it was something. "Show me," she said, her voice clearer, stronger than before. "Show me how to use the old pistol you keep in that chest." He looked at her, a long, searching look. Then, a slow nod. The pursuers were coming. But this time, she would not be entirely defenseless. And she would not be alone. The air in the cabin grew taut, charged with the anticipation of a confrontation that felt as inevitable as the setting sun. The riders came as the shadows lengthened, 3 dark figures against the blood-red sunset, their horses kicking up dust that swirled like angry spirits. They did not approach the cabin directly, but fanned out, their movements practiced, predatory. He had anticipated this, positioning himself not within the cabin, an easy trap, but higher up, amidst a jumble of granite boulders that overlooked the small clearing. He had given her the old pistol, heavy and cold in her trembling hands, and shown her where to hide, a narrow crevice between 2 rocks, shielded from direct view but with a sight line to the cabin door. "Stay down," he had ordered, his voice a low command. "Do not show yourself unless there is no other choice." His rifle was an extension of his arm, steady and sure. The lead rider, a burly man with a cruel twist to his lips and eyes like chips of obsidian, dismounted. He swaggered towards the cabin, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered gun. "Anyone home?" he called out, his voice oily, laced with a false congeniality that made her skin crawl. Silence answered him. The man exchanged a glance with his companions, who remained mounted, their rifles held ready. He kicked the cabin door open. It swung inward with a protesting groan. He peered into the dim interior. Empty. A string of curses followed. He emerged, his face dark with anger. She was here. That tracker wasn't wrong. Spread out. Find her. The boss wants her back, alive if possible, but he ain't particular about her condition. The words, meant for his men, struck her like a physical blow. Boss, that's what he called himself. Her owner. The man who believed her life was his to command, to break. A cold fury, unfamiliar and potent, began to burn through her fear. She gripped the pistol tighter, its weight a strange reassurance. One of the riders began to circle towards her hiding place. He was younger, eager, his eyes scanning the rocks. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She could hear the man's horse snorting, the creak of leather. Closer! Closer! A shot rang out, sharp and definitive. Not from her pistol. From the rocks above. The young rider cried out, clutching his shoulder, his rifle clattering to the ground as he slumped forward on his horse. The animal reared, panicked, then bolted. Damn it, the leader roared, spinning, his gun now drawn. Show yourself, you coward! The silent cowboy did not reply. Another shot, and the second rider's hat flew from his head, the man ducking low, scrambling for cover behind his horse. The leader fired wildly towards the boulders where the shots had originated, the bullets whining off the stone. He was exposed, angry, and losing control. This was not the easy retrieval he had expected. He's up there, he yelled. Get him! But his remaining companion was already retreating, urging his horse back the way they had come, unwilling to face the unseen marksman. The leader stood alone, fury contorting his features. He stared at the cabin, then at the rocks. He knew he was outmatched. With a final, frustrated curse, he backed away, his gun still aimed at the silent, watchful boulders. He remounted, his eyes burning with malice. This ain't over, he snarled, then wheeled his horse and galloped after his fleeing men, leaving a cloud of dust and impotent rage in his wake. Silence descended again, thick and heavy. The only sounds were the distant echo of hooves and her own ragged breathing. She stayed hidden, her body trembling, the pistol still clutched in her hand. After what felt like an eternity, the silent cowboy emerged from the rocks, his rifle held loosely at his side. He moved with the same unhurried grace, scanning the surroundings before slowly approaching her hiding place. He knelt beside her. His face was grim, but his eyes, when they met hers, held a quiet approval. They're gone, he said. For now she could only nod, the words caught in her throat. He gently took the pistol from her unresisting fingers. Her hand was white-knuckled, frozen around its shape. You did well, he said. You held steady. His praise, so rarely given, was like a balm. She had not fired. She had not needed to. He had protected her. But she had been ready. She had faced the fear, the embodiment of her past torment, and she had not broken. He helped her to her feet. Her legs were shaky. He offered an arm, and she took it, leaning on his strength. Together, they walked back towards the small cabin, a sanctuary defended, a battle won, not with overwhelming force, but with quiet courage and unerring aim. The sun had set, and the first stars were pricking the darkening sky. The air was cool and clean. The threat had been met, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, a fragile tendril of hope, stronger this time, unfurled within her. She was no longer just the hunted. She was the protected. And in some small, vital way, she had begun to protect herself. The days that followed were imbued with a new kind of quiet. The immediate threat had receded, leaving behind an awareness of danger, but also a sense of shared victory. The silent cowboy, whose name she still did not know, became less of an enigma and more of a companion. He spoke little, but his actions continued to weave a tapestry of care around her. He taught her to track, to read the signs of the wilderness, to distinguish the call of a hawk from the cry of a kestrel. He showed her which plants were for healing and which for sustenance. These were not lessons in survival for flight, but for living. She, in turn, brought a subtle change to the cabin. She found wild berries and stewed them with a little hoarded sugar he had, the sweet scent a small domestic miracle. She mended his worn shirts with finer stitches than he could manage. She even, one day, hummed a tuneless song while sweeping, a sound so unfamiliar it startled them both into a shared, fleeting glance that was almost a smile. The piece of wood she had clutched for so long now rested on the small shelf beside the carved bird. It seemed to have found its place. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the silence comfortable and deep, he looked at her. His gaze was direct, holding hers. "The man you fled," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "He will not stop looking. Men like that, they see a thing as theirs, they don't let go." She nodded, the old fear a dull ache rather than a sharp pain. "I know you need a name," he stated, not unkindly. "One they don't know. A name for this new place, this new life." She looked at him, her heart suddenly full. No husband, no name, no home. That had been her litany. He was offering her one of those things, perhaps the most important. A name was an identity. A shield. A beginning. "My wife," he said, his gaze drifting to the faded photograph. Her name was Sarah. "It's a good name." Strong, he looked back at her. "If you like it." Sarah. She tried the name in her mind. It felt solid. Rooted. Like the mountains around them. It was his wife's name, and the thought of taking it felt both like an honor and an immense responsibility. But she saw no possessiveness in his eyes, only a quiet offering. "Or," he continued, a rare hint of softness in his tone, "we can find another. One that fits you." She thought for a long moment, the fire crackling, the wind whispering outside. She looked at his face, weathered and kind, a face that had shown her more compassion than she had ever known. She thought of the cabin, this small pocket of safety he had carved out of the wilderness and shared with her. "Sarah," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I would like that." Sarah, a small, almost imperceptible nod from him. Sarah. Then he rose and went to a small, battered tin box he kept on a high shelf. He took out a worn leather-bound ledger and a stub of pencil. He opened it to a fresh page. For a long moment, he just looked at the blank paper. Then, with slow, deliberate strokes, he wrote. She couldn't see what he wrote from where she sat today. He closed the ledger and put it back. He turned to her. "Tomorrow," he said, "we ride to the settlement. There's a preacher there who also serves as a registrar. It's best to make things official." Her breath caught. "Official?" "My sister," he said, his gaze unwavering. "Sarah." "My sister. Come to live with me." It was not a proposal of marriage, not a romantic declaration. It was something far more profound in its simplicity. He was giving her his protection, his family, his name in the eyes of the world. A shield against the past. A claim of kinship that would deter those who hunted her? She would no longer be a nameless fugitive. She would be Sarah, his sister, a woman with a place, a protector, a name. Tears welled in her eyes, not of sorrow or fear, but of a deep, overwhelming gratitude. She could not speak. She simply nodded, a slow, profound affirmation. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw the faintest trace of a smile touch the corners of his lips, crinkling the lines around his winter sky eyes. It was a sunrise after a long night. She had no husband, but she had a brother. She had no home of her own, but she had a share in his. And she had a name. Sarah. Given to her by a silent cowboy, in the heart of a wilderness that had, against all odds, become her refuge, her beginning. The fire burned brightly, a beacon of hope in the vast, quiet darkness. What does it truly mean to give someone a name, a place, a chance to begin anew? Sometimes, the deepest connections are forged not in grand declarations, but in the silent offering of safety and the quiet gift of identity. Think about the moments in your life when a simple act of kindness changed everything. Let us know in the comments below. And if this story touched your heart, subscribe for more tales of resilience and redemption. Click the next video to see what unfolds.